when we take low doses of psilocybin mushrooms, our visual field significantly improves. And just as a really interesting anecdote, at the age of 10, I started to wear glasses. I was pretty nearsighted. That lasted until I was 22 or 23. And then as soon as I started to microdose consistently, my vision also dramatically improved to the point where I don't need glasses or contacts any longer to see long distances. So there's clearly something going on. And so McKenna hypothesized that, okay, mushrooms are pretty central then, both in our capacity to survive and hunt, because our visual field was essential in terms of our capacity to see and notice, but also in terms of the development of the brain and overall human consciousness.
I've heard you describe the time that we're in, specifically your world, as a psychedelic renaissance. Can you walk me through your journey of getting introduced into the world of psychedelics? And what do you mean when you say we're in a psychedelic renaissance?
So the phrase psychedelic renaissance comes from a psychiatrist, Ben Sessa. He coined the term probably about 12 years ago to talk about the resurgence of interest in psychedelics. And, the Renaissance era we most commonly know as coming after the Enlightenment, which came after the invention of the printing press. So literacy became more widely available. There was a renaissance in artwork, specifically with the Medici family. In Italy, you had Da Vinci and Michelangelo and, all these Italian painters who were supported by patrons, more or less, who wanted to see the resurgence of art out of the medieval ages. And so with sort of the psychedelic renaissance, we have, a topic or a substance that's been used for tens of thousands of years, and was also widely used during the counterculture, and is now sort of finally coming back into our cultural awareness in a way that feels intentional and responsible. And so there's this resurgence of interest. I even refer to it as the third wave of psychedelics, meaning the first wave was the ancient and indigenous use, and the second wave is the counterculture. And it presents an opportunity to not only address mental health issues, but also to help us look at performance and creativity from a new and unique lens. And that's how psychedelics came into my life. I was raised in a pretty traditional family in West Michigan, Grand Rapids, and, church was really the central and essential part of my life, as well as I played the violin and I played soccer and was pretty good in academics. So pretty standard middle class existence. And when I was 16, I tried cannabis for the first time, and my parents were not too happy about that. My dad sat me down one Sunday after church and said basically that he hadn't been this disappointed since his brother passed away in a car accident, in reference to me trying this illegal drug. So it was clearly impactful for them, probably even more so than for me to some degree. And then a few years after that, that same friend that introduced me to cannabis introduced me to psilocybin mushrooms and then LSD. And so at the age of 19, I had my first really meaningful experience with psychedelics. And one of the core insights that came from that experience was that I was raised in a culture and community that actually wasn't aligned with who I really was, my core values, and who I knew I was becoming, and that I would have to choose a more unconventional path if I wanted to become who I knew I was meant to become. And so those early psychedelic experiences set me down a path of becoming a digital nomad and traveling around the world, and then starting, my entrepreneurial journey. In 2015, I was living in Budapest, and it was at about the time where cannabis was starting to become more widely available. More states were legalizing cannabis. You had people like Tim Ferriss and Joe Rogan who were starting to talk about psychedelics pretty publicly. And then there was a lot of clinical research coming out of places like NYU, Johns Hopkins, UCLA. And so I just sort of saw what was happening. And I thought, I think psychedelics are going to be the next thing after cannabis, this sort of illegal substance that becomes reevaluated for both medicinal and also performance benefits. And so at that point in time, I just started publishing free education and guides and a podcast under Third Wave. And that just has sort of grown and evolved over the last 9 years. And now in 2024, we're fully in the thick of this psychedelic renaissance, this third wave of psychedelic. Last year in the United States, 8 million people took psilocybin mushrooms. That's about 3.1% of the population. 4 million people microdosed psilocybin mushrooms. and 61% of Americans now support legal psychedelic therapy. So we've made incredible strides in the last 9 years, and now we're sort of at the cusp of broader legalization and accessibility to these fascinating substances.
Yeah, that's fantastic, man. Got such, I think, profound insights to have at for you at such a young age, 19. Like, like that's not the average things that the 19-year-olds are thinking about. It's like, what am I here for? Like, am I going to be leading this kind of Renaissance type of thing? Like, when you initially went into that first experience, like, because I'm thinking back in my upbringing, right? We we played around with mushrooms, and I say play around with them because that's actually what we were doing. You speak much more eloquently. Like, were you using it for healing purposes, or were you kind of your typical teenager back then? And it's like you're doing things that's kind of against the grain. Like, where was your mind prior to that first experience?
Yeah, it's a little bit of everything in that way. I was always a prolific reader growing up. I was deeply curious. I remember when I was like 7 years old, we would have to keep track of how many books we read, and I read like 200 books or something insane when I was. So I was just deeply curious. I was always a little bit more introverted and curious, and so at the age of 19. I essentially the mushroom experience was interesting. That was about 2 grams of mushrooms. It was with 2 other friends, including this best friend of mine. And it was interesting, but not transformative. About 5 months after that, in May 2010, I did LSD for the first time. And that was essentially with 4 friends. And we went out into basically the woods and the beach for like 5 or 6 hours on this beautiful May day. So I didn't do it at a rave or a festival, but I also didn't do it necessarily therapeutically. It was a chance to connect with friends. It was definitely a chance to rebel, but I was also genuinely curious about what would happen and what I would experience. And I think, I mentioned this story with my parents, although they were, I grew up in a very sheltered environment. They were also very loving. There was a sense of unconditional love in that I could do what I wanted without fear of let's say retribution. And that was especially professionally, not so much personally, definitely around the drugs things, but especially professionally. And so I think I was fortunate that when I did start to do psychedelics at the age of 19 and 20, my parents, regardless of the path that I chose, were very supportive. Because a lot of parents who have, let's say, high functioning children, they want them to become lawyers or doctors. And then initially what I was studying medicine, or they want them to go to graduate school. And my parents are both very much like, just do what you want and we'll support you no matter what that is. And so I think there was now obviously doing LSD was the exception to that, but there was some freedom and capability in that way. And I was also very fortunate that I had a reasonably good upbringing. My parents are still married. I had no major trauma with a big T, no addiction issues, no abuse issues, none of that. Like we all have small traumas. Mine was mostly around guilt and shame, having been raised in a very sheltered religious environment, which I quickly worked through with psychedelics. So I didn't have to do a lot of this deep healing work. When I started working with psychedelics, it was just immediately I could go into more sort of dream state vision of, okay, if I could do anything with my life and my existence, what would that be? So I was very fortunate in that way.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I love that you're bringing a unique perspective because I think a lot of these conversations, at least the ones that we've had and kind of what you see in terms of the research and stuff that's being publicized out there is the use of these medicines for therapeutic healing, the PTSD, the veteran community and all that. I love that you're bringing a different perspective on it. Your journey has been the opposite of that because you've been able to lean into it as like you said, a performance enhancer, a creator enhancer, which we'll get into here in a minute on the microdosing side. But you talked about this third wave, and that's kind of how you see this third wave. That's the name of your organization. I think most people listening to this will understand that counterculture period right here in the States, 60s, 70s. It was kind of like this push of society up against, a hard government. A lot of these things were then kind of legalized back then. But I think what a lot of people maybe are not aware of is this first wave. Can you kind of talk about that first wave of psychedelic and the role that I played in maybe psychological evolution, societal evolution, or maybe if you have different language that you kind of use, like what role has this played in our development of human consciousness?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked about that. So when I stopped studying medicine, I started to study history. And so the lens that I bring into the psychedelic space is pretty diverse and interdisciplinary, but it definitely does come from this historical context lens. So there's really three, I would say, stories to focus on. The first story is that of Terence McKenna. So Terence McKenna was this Irish bard in the 1980s and 1990s who was a very eloquent speaker about psychedelics and altered states of consciousness. And he wrote a book called Food of the Gods in the early 90s where he sort of laid out this hypothesis of the stoned ape theory. And the stoned ape theory essentially said that our ancient hominid ancestors, even prior to Homo sapiens, so 1 million, 2 million years ago, when they were on the savannas of Africa, they consumed psilocybin mushrooms, and that the consumption of psilocybin mushrooms was integral to our overall evolution and development, both in terms of brain capacity and how quickly the brain grew, and then also in our capacity to survive. Because when we take low doses of psilocybin mushrooms, and I can attest to this, when we take low doses of psilocybin mushrooms, our visual field significantly improves. And just as a really interesting anecdote, I used to, at the age of 10, I started to wear glasses. I was pretty nearsighted. That lasted until I was 22 or 23. And then as soon as I started to microdose consistently, my vision also dramatically improved to the point where I don't need glasses or contacts any longer to see long distances. So there's clearly something going on. And so McKenna hypothesized that, okay, mushrooms are pretty central then, both in our capacity to survive and hunt, because that's our visual field was essential in terms of our capacity to see and notice, but also in terms of the development of the brain and overall human consciousness. Now, we fast forward a little bit to the first ancient civilization, which was called Göbekli Tepe, which they've discovered about 30 or 40 years ago. It's in southeast Turkey, and it goes back about 9 to 10,000 years. And in the sort of rediscovery of Göbekli Tepe, they found chalices that they used for religious rites and ceremonies. And on those chalices, they've actually found remnants of psychedelics. And so in the oldest ancient civilization that we currently have available to us, there were clearly some rites or ceremonies that were done with, usually it was an alcohol like beer that was infused with some sort of psychoactive or psychedelic compound. And then what we have even stronger evidence for is in ancient Greece, there were these mysteries called the Eleusinian mysteries, and they drank a beverage called koukion in the Eleusinian mysteries. And the main ingredient in koukion was ergot. And ergot is a fungus that grows on rye, and it's the same thing that LSD is made. And so essentially you had for 2,000 years these mysteries that existed in ancient Greece, where they drank a beverage that was made from essentially ancient LSD. And you had individuals like Plato and Aristotle and Marcus Aurelius who participated in these mysteries. And when Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire in the 4th century, they banned and prohibited these mysteries. And that's why when LSD came back on the scene in the 60s, it was such a dramatic shift, because for 1700 years, we as a Western culture, Western sort of people had no access to psychedelic substance, or very minimal. It was here and there, but very minimal. And so the 60s was a massive experiment. And what if we introduce, a bunch of LSD into our culture and see what happens? And what we found out is that could really lead to a lot of destabilization. And although there was a lot of great clinical research published in the 50s and 60s on LSD, because it was so legal and accessible and available up until about 1966 when California banned it, you had a lot of people who were dropping out. And you had a lot of people who were even having psychotic breaks. And so what I say nowadays is the problem wasn't LSD necessarily. The problem was that we were just doing way too much of it, way too often. And that's why I think in modern times with this third wave of psychedelics, microdosing is such a great modality, because you can still experience a lot of the same physiological benefits in terms of its impact on neuroplasticity and inflammation, but you don't necessarily have the same level of risk that you might have if doing a very high dose of a psychedelic.
Yeah, I love that so much, man. And I'm curious with you. You mentioned this restoration of your vision. Kind of an anecdote here, like you kind of walked us through how that's kind of helped you. Is there research kind of pointing to, I guess, the structural changes that are taking place when you're in micro or even macro dosing of psilocybin? Like what's leading to your kind of case study there? And are there other anecdotes similar to yours with people having, whether it's in impaired, not restored vision or other kind of brain healing taking place? Like, do we know the mechanism that is kind of firing there within the brain?
So it's interesting that you ask. I think at one point I did some study on specifically what's happening with the visual cortex when we're taking a psychedelic. I don't explicitly remember what that research said, but I do know when we take a psychedelic, essentially what's happening is it's activating something called the 5-HT2A receptor. So the 5-HT2A receptor, which is one of 14 serotonin receptors in the brain. And when we activate that receptor, what happens is it impacts the functioning of our prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex is actually the newest part of the brain. It's, where we got a lot of our capacity to make intelligent decisions and verbally communicate and, this whole sort of executive functioning. And I believe it has some tie-in as well to the visual cortex, because part of what made us so resourceful, our ancient ancestors, was the capacity to see decently well, hear decently well, move decently well. We were average at everything, but most importantly, we were above average in terms of our consciousness and our intellectual capacity. And so what's going on when we take a psychedelic, it's actually leading to an enhanced development of neuroplasticity. And so that's, I think, the key thing to focus on is when we take a psychedelic, it activates something called BDNF, brain-derived neurotropic factor, which they can actually trace through mechanism of action. When we activate the 5-HT2A receptor, it activates BDNF, which leads to better functioning in the prefrontal cortex. And with that better functioning, the brain becomes more plastic or malleable, which simply means that you can learn new behaviors easier. So when we take a high dose of a psychedelic, because there is a difference between a high dose and a microdose. It's kind of like, they're tuning into the same radio signal, but one is an FM and one is an AM channel. And so with a high dose of psychedelic, it's really activating that 5-HT2A receptor. It's creating massive new neuronal connections in the brain. The brain, the two hemispheres are really activated and communicating, and it essentially returns our brain to a childlike state. So when we take a high dose of a psychedelic, we kind of return to like we were when we were 5 years old. And what this does is it opens up something called the critical learning period. So the critical learning period is, when we're 5 years old, we're starting to learn language, we're starting to learn music, we're starting to learn, basic social functioning. Our brain is super plastic, it's super malleable, it's super open, and we can absorb all of that information in our early stages of development. And for years, scientists hypothesized that, okay, when that age is done, the brain, is no longer plastic. We no longer can change. We're stuck in our ways, which is what a lot of modern psychiatry is based on, unfortunately. And what we've now discovered through psychedelics, but also other practices like meditation, breathwork, yoga, these contemplative practices, is that we can actually reactivate neuroplasticity, and psychedelics happen to do it in the most effective sort of catalytic way. And when we take this psychedelic, it reopens a critical learning period. And so for about 2 to 3 weeks after a high dose of a psychedelic, we can actually, it's much easier to drop patterns of behavior that are no longer healthy, that are not serving us. It could be around diet, exercise, sleep. It could be around pornography. It could be around, a toxic relationship or a toxic job. We have the courage all of a sudden to make difficult decisions that we had previously been like, I'll do that at some point. All of a sudden it's like, no, I need to do that now. And then microdosing is a great way to elongate that critical learning period, to elongate that window of neuroplasticity. And so when we're actively microdosing after a high dose experience, all of a sudden that 3 week might turn into 5 to 6 weeks. And that's typically about the time that it takes to build and establish a new habit. And so the sort of summary of this is we take a psychedelic, right? It opens up this window of neuroplasticity. We commit to a microdosing protocol, which is usually 2 or 3 times per week for a period of 30 to 60 days. And that allows a space to actually weave in new patterns, weave in new behaviors that serve us in a much healthier and nourishing way.
Yeah, that may be the most well articulated explanation of the differences between the macro versus the microdosing that I've at least heard here on this show. Like I mentioned prior to us recording, we've explored this topic a handful of times. We had a great guest on, Neil Markey, just literally a few weeks back, that runs these therapeutic. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Neil's work, but they the Beckley retreats. Yeah, so they do more on the healing therapeutic side. He's got this background with Ranger and McKinsey, a lot of deep-seated therapy for or trauma for him that needed to be healed. And I'm curious, maybe for you, it's like, because you didn't have a lot of that needed to be unpacked, is that why you've kind of leaned into the microdosing as your expertise, because it allows you to enhance this creativity? Like, you didn't need to spend a lot of time, I guess, in the macro world, or yeah, I guess, how did you kind of land into microdosing being your area of expertise with so much that's out there in the world of psychedelics?
So I still do high dose work. I've worked extensively with ayahuasca, with psilocybin mushrooms, 5-MeO DMT, San Pedro with chuma. So every now and then, usually it's like every 6 months on average, I'll work with like a macro dose, a higher dose. And I almost see it as like a deep spiritual hygienic cleanse, but my more consistent practice is with these lower doses. And that could be a true microdose, which we would define as sub-intoxicating, meaning it's a dose you can take and you can still navigate your everyday life. You can, work your job. You can be with your family. You could even, I would not recommend this beginners, but like, I microdose today and I got to drive later and it's no problem because I'm not intoxicated whatsoever. Very subtle shifts that are noticeable, and typically they're not noticeable on the day of. You're really looking at, how am I changing after 4 weeks to 6 weeks to 8 weeks, right? That's really what we're paying attention to. And so I find with these lower doses, whether it's a microdose or what I would call a medi dose or even a museum dose, that I can still stay in my sort of normal individual life, but I'm a little bit more open. I'm a little bit more flexible. I'm a little bit more creative, but I'm not totally disassociated or checked out like I am in a high dose experience. I'm not going deep into a journey where I need an eye mask and, total silence and all that. There's a time and a place for that. But for me as an entrepreneur, it's like, again, that might be every 6 months, but in my day to day, these lower doses are much more effective. Now, the reason I focused on it publicly so much is a bit of a different story. I would say, my goal and my mission since I started Third Wave in 2015 is, how do we legalize psychedelics? As simple as that. How do we make psychedelics culturally accessible and available to every adult who wishes to use them to either heal trauma or to benefit their overall well-being? And as I studied a lot of the history around psychedelics, and as we've talked about today, I came to realize that historically, the only times in which we've used high doses have been in these mystery schools, which are very private, very secret, very underground. Also, in ancient indigenous communities in the Amazon, in Mexico, in Africa, and even in Asia. So it's very contained. It's within a community, or in the more modern times in sort of a strict clinical therapeutic regulated environment where you have a guide and there's a container. Whenever it's like in the 60s, when we've tried to give high doses of LSD and legalize it for everyone, it tends to be more chaotic than helpful. And so with the sort of core mission or goal being everyone should have access to these, really, well, the safest and most responsible way to do that is to communicate why microdosing is actually a much more beneficial way to work with psychedelics for the vast majority of humans. That the vast majority of humans just want to feel better. They want to have a better mood. They want to get better sleep. They want to have a better sex life. They want to have more energy, right? They're not as interested in these really profound mystical experiences that high doses of psychedelics bring about. They just want to feel better. And so my hypothesis has always been probably 5 to 10% of people would be a good fit to work with something like ayahuasca or high doses of mushrooms or LSD. But the vast majority, 90% of people, would not, that they may just benefit from microdoses. And so that's why I found it to be so important to emphasize microdosing, to educate around microdosing, because I see it as a bridge to broader cultural accessibility.
Yeah, I love your protocol there that you kind of explained, every 6 months or so. It's almost like, going to the dentist, twice a year, you get the big kind of, deep cleanse. And then it's like, no, you got daily maintenance. You're going to brush your teeth a couple times a day. You're going to mouthwash, you're going to floss. Like that kind of becomes the microdose in the couple times per week. I'm curious with these 8 million that use them. I think you said 8 million Americans use psychedelics, 3.1% of the population in the last year. Mushrooms specifically. Okay. And then 4 million are microdosing. So about 1.5% of the population is microdosing. Do we have data around who these individuals are? I mean, are they middle class? Like, are they on the higher end of the income earning potential? Are they professionals? Like, is there any data around the people that are currently using mushrooms right now?
So I know the research that was done, I was just actually doing a little bit of a review this morning on it. It was a sample size of 3,200 people that was representative of the American population. So it's not as if they could survey. I mean, and this is how most population surveys are done, right? You have to kind of find a representative sample. And so that representative sample was representative of the entire American population. And so what I can tell you is that there's, I would say, 3 types of people who are most commonly microdosing as a starting point, right? One are people who are on psychiatric medications like Prozac, Zoloft, Lexapro, Wellbutrin, or other mood stabilizers, benzodiazepines like Xanax, or even antipsychotics. That they've been on these psychiatric medications for a very long time. I would also include ADHD medication in that, Adderall, Ritalin, what's the other one? Vyvanse. So, getting off and weaning off these psychiatric medications through a microdosing protocol is one of the core intentions. And then even as people are weaned off these medications, they continue to microdose almost as a prophylactic against depression. So they're still taking, you could call it a pill, but if you sort of do a head-to-head comparison of psychiatric medications versus microdoses, you come to realize that microdoses basically beat psychiatric medications at everything. They're, psychiatric medications are very addictive. They have a lot of negative side effects. They can lead oftentimes to suicidality, to decreased sexual function, to various other really nasty side effects. Microdoses literally have very few side effects. They are anti-addictive. They are physiologically healthy in terms of both anti-inflammatory and boosting neuroplasticity. And there's a range of other benefits as well. So head to head, I think microdosing wins on almost every account. The challenge, of course, is most microdoses are made of psilocybin mushrooms. Anyone can grow mushrooms. In fact, even on Third Wave, we have a mushroom grow kit where people can just grow their own mushrooms. It's a little box you stick in a drawer, and 6 weeks later you have mushrooms. So pharmaceutical companies, especially big pharmaceutical companies, can't really profit off of these microdoses as much. And so that's the first archetype. The second group of people are people like myself and yourself. We're entrepreneurs, we're creatives, we are maybe engineers, software engineers, product engineers, lawyers, medical doctors, people who, aren't necessarily interested in deep traumatic work or deep therapeutic work, but just want to enhance their overall existence. They're interested in how it could help them to sleep better. They're interested in how it could help them to have better mood, more energy, more neuroplasticity, better physiological health and well-being. And so they're looking at microdosing more as a tool of enhancement and performance rather than strictly as a, let's say, antidepressant or anti-anxiety medication. And then I would say the third type of people are people in their later stages of life who are looking to microdose as a way to stay cognitively sharp, right? Maybe they've had dementia or Alzheimer's in their family, or maybe they've noticed that their memory isn't quite as good as it used to be, or maybe they've noticed that, they could just use a little bit more of a pep in their step. And so you have a lot of folks in their 60s, 70s, and even 80s who are starting to take these low doses of psychedelics just to continue to stay alert and active and alive in their day-to-day. So I would say those are the 3 most common. There's definitely a few others, like even as a bonus, I would say a lot of college students and even professional athletes who don't want to take Adderall and Ritalin to study and be focused or for performance. They're looking at kind of how could I take these microdoses or low doses of psychedelics to help support. So in other words, pretty much anyone you can imagine from the ages of 19, 20, 21 to the ages of 85 to 86, people who are in the professional space, people who are stay-at-home moms, people who are working as therapists or doctors or are seeing a therapist or doctor. It really scans or spans the entire populace that we know of. Um, I'd say final note is it's probably largely white people as well. There's definitely a lot of minorities participate in psychedelic work, but I would say for various reasons, which we probably don't have the time to dig into now, illegal drugs, especially psychedelics, have largely been a white person thing in the United States. Um, that's, depending on the jurisdiction in places like Oakland, where it's decriminalized, I would say more and more of the Black community is becoming open to this and working with it and interested in it. But probably 80 to 90% of people who take psychedelics currently are white.
Yeah, the professional athletes one was one that got me there when you were talking, as you were kind of speaking to earlier with kind of this visual enhancement. I'm thinking of, these sports that are so relied on, hand to eye coordination, thinking baseball, hitting a round ball with a round bat at, 95 miles per hour. Moving is often said one of the most challenging, difficult things to do in all professional sports. And if you could enhance your visual abilities, right, get more laser focus in on that, I can kind of take that to the next level. I'm curious if there's any kind of legalization around the sports and the use of it that maybe you could speak to here in a minute. But I want to kind of zero in on this entrepreneurs, creators, right, on how they're using it. So that's going to be, the audience here. We're not going to have a lot of single moms. We're going to have a lot of elderly people, a handful of college students that can maybe use it. Our audience is going to be the guys out there that are out there, building businesses, maybe, trying to accelerate up a corporate ladder. In terms of, I guess, kind of like getting started, right? We want to point them obviously to your book. We're not going to be able to unpack everything here with the entire conversation, but I guess this isn't something you just jump into and you think it's going to solve the problem. You talk about microdosing as being a skill that we must develop. So let's kind of maybe start at the beginning of the development of that skill. Like, where do you even know if you're ready to kind of add this into your day to day?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think it's better to talk about who this would not be a great fit for, because for the vast majority of people, I think it's beneficial. Just like I would argue that the vast majority of people would benefit from taking creatine, from collagen protein, from fish oil, from lion's mane, right? I look at microdosing not only as a skill, but also a supplement that has just purely physiological benefits that, if done consistently, will help. And they are unique in that they do impact neuroplasticity and brain functioning in a certain way, where anyone who has a predisposition to psychosis or schizophrenia that runs in the family should be basically not working even with low doses of psychedelics. Anyone who is on an SSRI currently should be very mindful about how they choose to weave in microdosing, because I would say there are still a lot of high performers who are on Adderall, who may be on an antidepressant, or there's overlap here. So anyone who's listening who's like, I'm interested in this, but they are on a psychiatric medication, typically what I advise is work with something like ketamine first, which is a legal psychedelic and interacts in the brain in such a way where you can take that totally and completely safe while you're on an SSRI, and do that under the guidance of a psychiatrist or therapist, transition off the SSRIs, and once you're off SSRIs, then start to microdose. I would say those are like the two exceptions. But if, I would say the vast majority of people listening to this, they're not on psychiatric medication. They're interested in performance. My perspective is always start with a float tank, go float a little bit, maybe go practice breath work, even if it's just Wim Hof breath work. Go do maybe a meditation, right? Study or practice, like download the Waking App Guide or Headspace and just start to practice a little bit of meditation. And after there's some familiarity with those things, like I think microdosing can be easily woven in. And even prior to that, I would say if someone's pretty gung ho and they're like, that sounds like a lot of extra steps, I just want to microdose, I would say for, again, the vast majority of people who are listening to this, just start to microdose. And typically what I say is start low, go slow. You can always take more. You can't necessarily take less. Psilocybin mushrooms are the easiest things to access. So typically I advise start with 50 milligrams of psilocybin mushrooms. The typical microdose is anywhere from 100 milligrams to 200 milligrams of psilocybin mushrooms. And so usually I'd say try 50, try 100, try 150, and try 200, and see how each one of those feels for you. And essentially you're trying to find your top limit. What dosage can you take where you're like, okay, I definitely notice this, right? I definitely feel this. It's a little too much. I want to take it down a bit of a notch. So a lot of the initial, let's say 2 to 3 weeks of the microdosing protocol is the calibration time where you're experimenting, bit of trial and error to try to get it right for what you need. And LSD would be, instead of 50 milligrams, it's 5 micrograms of LSD. And then you could start 5, 10, 15, 20, just to see how that feels. The core difference between LSD and psilocybin is LSD is more dopamine. So dopamine is tied to focus, attention, and motivation. It's more stimulating as well. So if someone struggles with anxiety, I would say do not take LSD, stick with psilocybin. If someone's more melancholic and more sort of depressed, I would say explore LSD rather than psilocybin, because that more active dopamine through LSD has a bit more of like, it's going to make you more extroverted. It's going to make you more stimulated, almost like nicotine would in a way. So, and then stick to a protocol of a minimum of 4 weeks. And so what we've seen in clinical research with microdoses is the greatest impact is after the 4-week mark. So do it 2 or 3 times per week, do it for a minimum of 4 weeks. And then after those 4 weeks, then assess, what have I noticed? What's changed? Am I getting better sleep? And you could track that through something like an Aura ring, right? Am I, how's my mood? Am I generally noticing that I'm a little less reactive? I'm a little bit more clear. I'm a little bit more present. How's my energy? Am I noticing I don't, get as tired as quickly? I have, better endurance, less fatigue. Those are the 3 most common benefits that people report from a microdosing protocol. Is after 4 weeks, they get better sleep, they have a better mood, and they have more energy. And so I think just paying attention to that and noticing that, that's a really great way to start with a microdosing protocol. And then from there, there's a lot more complexity about, experimenting with different psychedelics. So if you did LSD, maybe trying psilocybin or combining psilocybin with other, herbs or functional mushrooms or other supplements, or, there's different protocols. So there's a lot more that we can get into, but I think 6 are minimum 4 weeks, 2 or 3 times per week, LSD or psilocybin, and start low and go slow, right? The whole point of those first 2 weeks is calibration and experimentation.
Yeah, and obviously, Paul, we're speaking around subjects today that these are still illegal, right? So we need to be very cautious with people. Like, what's a disclaimer out there, maybe for people that are going to kind of explore this? I mean, you got to be very careful where you're even acquiring these things. You need to be careful with possession. Can we speak to just maybe kind of a disclaimer? Anybody that's going to take this information and actually begin to kind of explore it on their own?
Yes, that's a great question. So Colorado, it's legal, which is interesting. So you have psilocybin that's legal. They passed something called the Natural Medicine Health Act. And so if you
Can you
go
buy
to
it in a dispensary like you would with?
You can't. No. So it's not like cannabis that way. You can pay for services like therapy or coaching, and the microdoses can be provided as part of that. But generally, mushrooms are legal in Colorado, and they're also legal in Oregon. And then there are a number of jurisdictions, Seattle, Detroit, Oakland, and a number of other smaller like university towns like Ann Arbor, Cambridge, and Berkeley that have decriminalized plant medicines. So people in those jurisdictions can have personal possession of those and not worry. I would say beyond that, what's really interesting right now is it's very easy to access microdoses, especially psilocybin, that there's a lot of websites online that will openly sell psilocybin, that it still is a Schedule 1 substance. It still is illegal. And there's really not any cases of people who are getting arrested and thrown in jail for personal possession of psychedelics at this point in time, largely because the DEA and state law enforcement is very focused on fentanyl and cocaine and organized crime. And with all the research coming out on psychedelics and the sort of general change in public awareness around them, law enforcement is just not as interested and curious about it. So with all that said, especially if people are interested in microdosing, I do a group coaching experience called the Microdosing Experience. We'll kick the next one off in the new year, but people can sign up now. And so if people want to be in a group, they want to get coached through it, we also help with sourcing and accessibility. I would say just go to Third Wave and find the Microdosing Experience, and that's going to be a great step for a lot of folks who want support as part of this journey.
Yeah. And guys, we're just touching the surface here today of this conversation. I mean, Paul may be somebody we need to have on here for a more in-depth one-on-one here. But yeah, we'll have all his Third Wave stuff plugged down there in the show notes below. You can definitely explore that. He's got a great book on microdosing as well. You spoke to anybody kind of jumping right in, starting small, building up, that kind of tolerance there, assessing where it is, that kind of integration into your lifestyle. But you had mentioned previously, like the use of a high dose experience, then followed with 4 to 6 weeks of microdosing after the fact. Who's the best case for that type of experience where they need to go big, have that massive kind of rush wave of that, 5 gram experience, whatever the case may be, and then following it up with some very intentional microdosing? Like, who is the case study for that experience?
So a lot of what I mentioned before in terms of who it's not for applies, but doubly so. Like, especially no one who has a family history of psychosis, schizophrenia, all those sorts of things. Definitely don't do high doses of psychedelics. Further, if you have bipolar or borderline personality disorder, be very mindful or careful about going into psychedelic work. And then if you're on psychiatric medications, start with ketamine, which is a legal dissociative and can be used with a psychiatrist or clinical psychologist. And start with ketamine if you are on psychiatric medications. Now, for everyone else who's not on psychiatric medications, who's curious about psychedelics, typically what I say is like the best indicator is if they're curious and open to it. If it's been on their radar, if they've read the research, if they've maybe seen how Aaron Rodgers drank ayahuasca or Steve Jobs talked about LSD, and they're inspired to go, okay, I wonder what this could do for me, and I think this is usually when it comes up as an option for people. It's like, it's just when something isn't working, it's like they've been in a relationship that just isn't working, but they're having a hard time, breaking it off. They're in a job that they've been in for years and they make good money, but they know that there's something deeper that's calling them, and they're having a hard time quitting that job and making that leap. Or they just feel like generally like life has been a little blasé and gray, and it just isn't that interesting anymore. And, it's kind of boring. And so anyone who feels like just a little stuck, like they've been trying to make changes, but they haven't really been able to make the changes that they know they're capable of making. They feel like life is fine, or maybe even life is like very blah. These are people who, and they know, they've read a little bit. They've listened to some podcasts. They're open to it, right? Because, what isn't so great is when people feel forced into it. They feel obligated to do it. They feel pressured into it, right? Psychedelics are such a sort of catalytic and volcanic experience that someone has to really willfully choose it. So willful choice is, I think, the most essential part. It's like cold plunging, right? If someone doesn't want to go in a cold plunge and you stick them in a cold plunge, they're going to be like, fuck you, like, why did you make me go in that cold? It's terrible. And they're actually not going to get a lot of the physiological benefits from the cold if they are forced to be in the cold. Whereas, if someone's ready, if they're like, they've done the breath work, they've done the Wim Hof, they've read about the physiological benefits, and they're like, I'm going to do this. I know it's going to be hard. I know it might suck. I know like I'm going to have to breathe through it, but I want to do this. And they go in the cold plunge and they stick it out for 3 minutes and they come out and they feel amazing on the back end of that. A high dose of psychedelics is like that, but instead of 3 minutes, it could be up to 4 hours, And so I think just knowing what you're getting into, knowing that you could experience heaven, it could be bliss and joy and oneness and awe, but it could also be hell. It could be, difficulty. It could be hell realms. It could be, you have to face and confront childhood memories and traumatic experiences that have happened to you, right? This really can open up both of those gates, which is why it's so essential to have a practitioner, a coach, a therapist, a guide, that if you want to do a high dose of a psychedelic, work with a professional, right? And so even at Third Wave, we've trained a few hundred coaches and practitioners and guides in how to work with psychedelics. And so if someone's like, I feel called to do a high dose, on Third Wave, we have one-to-one coaching where we set up a container for folks, and they can actually, we pair them with one of our coaches, and they guide them through an 8-week experience with a high dose of a psychedelic. So that I think is the most important thing. If someone feels called to this, if they've done their research, they feel stuck, like they know they could just shift some energy, do it with a guide, do it with someone in your corner to start with. Don't just take 5 grams of mushrooms at home and see what happens. It's a recipe for potential death.
Yeah, no, 100%. I appreciate that disclaimer there. So my world is in behavioral change, addiction recovery, specifically with guys that overcome pornography. But we're going to have guys out there, audience listening, that's maybe struggling with smoking. They've been on nicotine for decades. Maybe they're struggling with marijuana. Maybe food it is. Maybe it's Netflix. Maybe it's gaming. I know one of the big things that people are using this microdosing for is that behavioral change. You said it opens up the neuroplasticity. We can kind of induce some new healthy habits. Do you have any, case studies or kind of specific anecdotes of people that you've either worked with or seen use this in terms of breaking addictive patterns in their life?
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell my own story. That's probably the story that I can tell best in a way. That I always grew up. I would dabble in things, but I never had an addictive personality. Like I smoked weed here and there, but I never got really deep into weed. Or every now and then I have a cigarette, but never got deep into it. I did struggle probably from the age of 14 to 20 with pornography addiction. And actually, when I started to first work with LSD when I was 19, it actually really helped me to stop. LSD was probably the thing. Psychedelics were probably the thing that helped me to recognize how unhealthy it was, for how I perceived women and my energetics and all those things. And actually doing a lot of LSD, I probably did it 15 or 20 times when I was 19, 20, 21, helped me to just totally stop watching pornography, to the point where in the last 15 years, here and there it'll pop up, but I might go 6 months, 9 months, a year, 18 months, 2 years without ever watching anything. And it's mostly softcore for sort of enjoyment at this point. So I think that for me was a huge, huge step in my own path and process of becoming a man, is how psychedelics helped me to quit my pornography addiction, because they helped me to recognize just how unhealthy it was and how much energy I was giving up outside of myself to this kind of slightly demonic thing. Um, I would say then, when I was 26, I moved to New York and started to smoke cannabis more regularly. And for about 4 or 5 years, I was a regular cannabis smoker. And last year, I did a very, what they call a dieta with ayahuasca, which is where you go to the jungle for 10 days. It's silence for 10 days. You drink ayahuasca 5 times. It's with the Shipibo, who are an indigenous people who work with ayahuasca. And you have to have no cannabis for a month before, no cannabis for a month after. And so it's about 2.5 months. And I just continued that. So for about 8 months, I smoked no cannabis. And so deep work with ayahuasca, and just sort of, I think it's a lot about resetting these dopamine pathways, but also finding the deeper purpose as to like, why am I doing this? And what things do I need to change about the way that I live to ensure that I'm not continuing to fall into these same patterns and behaviors? Because although I quit pornography, stopped watching pornography, still for the last 15 years, I would masturbate pretty regularly, and now in the last just 3 months, like I would always journal in the last few years, especially. I'm like, the two things that are blocking me are my cannabis use and my specifically ejaculation. And so for the last 3 months now, I've been practicing semen retention, and I've had no cannabis as well. And I've just noticed my energy is way higher. My sleep is way better. My focus is way higher. And so psychedelics helped with that for sure. Microdosing, I've been microdosing with San Pedro, Wachuma for these last few months, and that's been really helpful for it. But I think also I just reached a point in my life where I was just like frustrated and struggling with a couple things where I was like, these patterns have to die if I'm going to step into the new person that I'm becoming. So all that to say, psychedelics can be helpful, but they're definitely not the only thing. There also, I think, has to be a deeper purpose for the quitting and the shifting. And psychedelics provide the insight, but we still have to show up and do the work ourselves to actually make it real.
100%, Paul. Dude, I appreciate the vulnerability there. And, I think, the guys out there that are familiar with our work and what we do at Rebuild to Recovery, we talk about the death of the old self. We talk about it's not about quitting this behavior. It's creating a life where that behavior no longer fits into it. You got to establish a bigger sense of purpose and meaning for why you're here on this earth. That porn or masturbation or whatever these vices are just doesn't align with where it is you're trying to go. So I'm so glad that your experience and how you've used these as a tool to help maybe kind of open up and help you find that bigger meaning runs 100% in alignment with the work that we do in helping high performing men. We're not talking about like, we don't help guys that are like living in their mom's basement and can't afford a high ticket program. Like we help the business owners, the entrepreneurs, the executives, the pro athletes out there that are succeeding, but they feel empty inside because this thing has a grip on them. So I'm glad we got to kind of explore that a little bit. And I appreciate your vulnerability. Paul, we're going to have all your stuff with Third Wave. We're going to have your book, the coaching, all that stuff plugged down there in the show notes. I want to make sure the guys can check out more if they want to go deeper into this topic. But as we wrap up today's conversation, we love to end with the same and final question. So title of the show is called The Superhuman Life. Paul Austin, as we close out today's conversation, how would you define living a superhuman life?
Yeah, I think a superhuman life is the capacity to recognize the importance of self-realization, so transcendence, connection to something greater, being a vessel for the divine, um, maintaining a close relationship with the mystery and sort of the mystery of existence in life, and paradoxically also being fully of this world and committed to our growth and transformation, and committed to building, and committed to family, and committed to really making a better life for everyone here on this earth and being in service. Right. I think most of all, superhuman life is having the humility and the capacity to recognize what it means to live a life of service, a life of helping others, and just remembering how, I think, miraculous it is that we get to exist and sort of play in this.
Amen to that, man. Beautiful stated. Paul, I appreciate you, brother. Thank you so much. Guys, connect with Paul, Third Wave, pick up his book, follow him on Instagram. We have all that stuff plugged down in their show notes. Like this episode, share it, rate, review, get out there for as much as we possibly can. But for your host, Coach Frank Rich, Paul, we'll see you guys next week. We love you guys.